spring semester, we'll continue the series every Wednesday at this time, and you can join online if you'd like. And that's why we're trying to deal with the mics here. But we don't have usually a lot of interaction with people from the outside, but we like to offer that. So today we have Jessica Ahlstrom with us, who is a graduate of MSU and the Land Resources Environmental Science Department, and she was in land rehab, she tells me. She now works for the city of Bozeman and as the water conservation specialist. And so after graduating from MSU, and she got her BS degree, she went then to Arizona and got a certificate of connecting environmental science and decision making. So
long name, yes.
Yeah. So welcome, and we're anxious to hear about the city of Bozeman and what they're thinking about conservation of water.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone who's joining either online or in the room. So I guess I'll just jump right in. Thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about Bozeman's water future. Specifically, I'm going to touch on what the city is doing in terms of new water supply development, water conservation efforts, and then toward the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about drought management at the city. So to start off, we can't talk about water without making sure everybody knows where it comes from. So the city gets water from three main sources. All of it is surface water and snowpack dependent, and that's kind of going to be a theme that we come back to a few times throughout this presentation. So we get about 40% of our water from Highlight Creek and Highlight Reservoir, 40% from Bozeman Creek or Sourdough Creek, and another 20% from Lyman Creek or Lyman Spring. You can see on the map here, that's up in the Bridgers, and if you're looking at the M, it's that drainage like just to the north of the M, if you can't picture that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this guiding document behind the city's water supply planning. So in 2012, the city adopted an integrated water resources plan, which was a proactive document and a proactive approach to guiding the city's future water supply use and policy practices and things like that. The goal of the document was really to balance our water supply and demand as the city continues to grow. And it recommended different measures to study more in the future. So it was kind of a kickoff document that made suggestions for how the city can make sure that we have a reliable water supply and what to do next in terms of exploring that a little bit more. I want to mention that it was a stakeholder-driven process. So there was a technical advisory committee composed of various community members, from scientists to members of the DNRC, Trout Unlimited, and things like that. So this was driven by stakeholders to make sure that everybody had a seat at the table. And ultimately, the Integrated Water Resources Plan looks at three main different ways of managing our water supply, which are on the left side of the screen there. So first, water supply planning. You can kind of think of that as your, I like to say, kind of hard engineering approach. So how are we going to actually get more water for the future? Things like building dams, drilling wells, those are all examples of that. Water conservation planning, or reducing overall demand so that the water we have now goes a little bit further, and drought management planning as well. Ultimately, the Integrated Water Resources Plan recommends that water conservation, or that demand reduction, part of that little graphic there, fill about 50% of our future water supply demand gap over the next 50 years. So it's a pretty substantial amount. That 50% is about 10,000 acre feet. And I can't do a water talk without talking about what an acre foot is. So an acre foot of water is, if you can visualize an acre of land a foot deep, that's what that is. And it's about 326,000 gallons, just a little less than that. So 10,000 of those is a pretty substantial amount of water. And the city is focusing on generating that through conservation.
That's per year?
I'm sorry, that's across the next 50 years.
Oh,
So our goal is to generate 10,000 feet, thank you, or 10,000 acre feet over 50 years. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that we're really supply limited here in Bozeman. We're literally at the headwaters of the Missouri River Basin. And so we have no upstream to go to get more water. We're in a semi-arid climate, and depending on where you're at in Bozeman, we're receiving about 16 inches of annual precipitation a year. For a frame of reference, in Tucson, we received like 11. So we're not far above that. And like I mentioned earlier, we rely entirely on snowpack and surface water for our water supply. And we expect to see a changing climate impact our water supply. Specifically, we expect to see more rain than snow, which poses a problem when you rely on snow for your water. And we also expect to see earlier peak runoffs and drier, hotter summers. So for all of those reasons, Bozeman's really drought prone, and we'll talk more about drought in a little while. Additionally, we are in a closed basin. And so what that means is, the city has a water right portfolio of surface water rights. Well, all of the surface water rights available in our basin have already been appropriated or spoken for. And so the city can't just go buy more surface water rights. They've already been allocated. So we're limited in our ability to do that. Water conservation is really cost effective. So for the city to go purchase an acre foot of water, it costs about $6,000 generally. Water conservation generates that acre foot for roughly $1,000. So it's quite a bit more affordable for us to just save the water we have than to go buy new water. Plus, it's difficult for us to buy that water anyway at this point. Water conservation, of course, has an immediate return. So any water that we have available today that we save, we can use tomorrow. Whereas if we were to develop a new supply, there's a lot of cost and infrastructure that comes along with that. And finally, as everyone here knows, Bozeman is growing very fast, and that is putting us on a fast track to the point at which we expect our demand for water to exceed supply. Specifically, this graph here shows that in a little more detail. So you have population on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. The blue dots are our census population from 2000 until 2016. And then the red line is our population projection if we continue to grow at the rate that we have been for the last 4 years, which is at 4.3%. So if we continue to grow at that rate, and if we all continue to use the amount of water that we're using today, we expect our demand to exceed our water supply, which is currently up in that box there, 11,500 acre feet, in about 11 years. So that's pretty soon. And that's, again, just to clarify, that's if we continue to grow at the rate we have been, and if we continue to use that same amount of water we're using. Yeah.
This projection includes the amount of water that we might fight increasing forest fires in the future?
This number does not. So our integrated water resource plan did look at, not really specifically addressing wildfire, but it did look at potential climate change impacts and tried to account for that. This is not accounting for that. It's maybe not the most accurate projection because it's kind of cut and dry just based on water use and growth rate. Good question. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're using our water and kind of where opportunities to reduce the amount of water we're using are. So this is showing basically where all residential homes, so multifamily or single family homes, are using water. 60% of that water is being used on our lawns and landscapes in the summer. And you can see on the left the various indoor uses with toilets, faucets, and showers being the biggest ones. So I want to talk a little bit more about outdoor water use. This graph here is showing 2017 monthly water demand by customer class. And I know that the graphic's a little difficult to see. There are different colors on there which represent customer classes. And those big green lines are single family homes. And so across all customer classes in the summer, half of all that water used across everybody is used on our lawns. But if you just look at single family homes, 70% of single family home water use in the summer goes into our lawns. So that's really kind of our low-hanging fruit, so to speak. We're really trying to work with the public and educate residents about how to maybe save some water outside. On average, the average single-family home uses 115 gallons of water a day. But in July and August, that jumps up to 560 gallons. So we do offer some resources to try to help bring down those really big green lines on that that graph that we just had up. Some of those are our indoor rebates. So we will actually give residents a cashback rebate to install high efficiency plumbing fixtures, toilets, shower heads, clothes washers. And we actually offer free shower heads. If you bring in your old shower head, we'll give you a new one. There's an example of one on the back table for those of you in the room. And we'll give away free high efficiency faucet aerators as well. And so far, since we have started with all these programs, we're saving about 25 million gallons of water a year just through our indoor rebates. We also offer a host of outdoor rebates as well. So we will also give you money for installing a high efficiency weather-based irrigation controller. Those basically take the guesswork out of watering. They use evapotranspiration, so they use basically weather data to determine when to water for you. Rain sensors, which will tell your system to turn off during and after a rain event. So you won't be that neighbor that's watering when it's raining outside. We offer rebates on high efficiency nozzles. That bottom picture is a picture of one of those. If you've seen those are much more efficient than the nozzles that have that big fan spray of water. A lot of that water from the inefficient nozzles gets lost to wind drift and things like that. We will also offer rebates for drip irrigation and drought tolerant plants as well. So there's a lot of opportunity. We want to help you reduce your outdoor water use. We also offer free sprinkler system assessments. So this would be for any resident on city water. And basically the process is we'll come to your home, we'll look through your irrigation system, identify any needs of system repair, any opportunities to make it more efficient. And maybe the biggest part of this is that we'll create a customized watering schedule for you based on your landscape and based on your system performance. We've done 130 assessments so far, and we estimate that just through revised watering schedules, we're saving about 2 million gallons of water a year through those assessments. So there's definitely a big opportunity to typically reduce your water use and still keep your turf in good shape. I wanted to mention too, we have a few projects around the city that are displaying drought tolerant plants. The purpose of these is exactly that, to be a demonstration for residents so they can see what these plants look like up close in person. We started with the medians on North 7th Avenue. Does anyone know, can you picture those medians? Awesome. So, and there's that top picture is the picture of that. We installed that as our first demonstration to see what we could really get in water savings by installing these types of plants. And we're seeing that that median uses 86% less water per square foot than a turf grass median on Valley Center Road. So huge water savings opportunity there. We also installed a demonstration garden at City Hall to display these plants. And just this summer, another one at the Museum of the Rockies. So all those old juniper bushes are gone, and there are pretty colorful drought tolerant plants there. We'll have some educational signage up this year for those, so please feel free to go by the museum and check those out. We also have, for those of you online, you can't see this, but I'm holding up our Water Smart Planting Guide. This goes out in the paper every spring, and it has 7 or 8 pages of drought tolerant plant lists. All of those qualify for the rebate, and so there's a ton of good information here if you're more of a do-it-yourself kind of person on how to save some water. And I can't go without mentioning this. This has been a project, this customer water use portal has been a project for a couple of years, and we are now, as of a couple of days ago, testing this internally. And so this will be launched to the public soon. And it's an online portal meant for your smartphone, so you don't have to sit down at a computer to do this. And basically, this is an opportunity for anyone to take a little more ownership. They're a little curious about their water use. It will actually compare your household water use to similar households with the same number of people, same amount of turf grass, that kind of thing. It'll compare you to efficient households. So kind of tells you whether or not you're like in that top 20% or not and how to get there. And it'll set efficiency goals for you and also show you, so the city's rate structure is tiered. So the more water you use, the more you pay. And so it'll show you exactly where you fall on that rate structure as well if you're trying to keep your bills down. And last but not least, it will give you leak alerts too. So you don't have to wait a month to find out that you've had a leak for 3 weeks. You can actually get that a lot sooner with this application. So we'll be doing a big education outreach push when this is live, but just keep that in mind that it's coming soon. And we also just released this month, we started our commercial rebate program with the best marketing campaign that I think I've ever seen. So we offer all the same rebates that we do for residential homes that I've already touched on today. We also offer free pre-rinse spray valves for restaurants or hotels. And we offer free water use assessments for restaurants, hotels, and multifamily buildings. So we can go on site, help figure out how much water you're using and where the best opportunities are for you to reduce that water use. So if you have anyone in mind, or if you yourself own a commercial building or a small business, whatever it is, feel free to reach out. All of this information is on our website as well. Okay, so I'm going to start to talk a little bit about kind of what the utility is doing and some of our other water supply projects. But if you have any questions about conservation, please let me know as we go forward. I've listed a few things. So the city is asking people to save water, and the city wants to do the same thing. And so I've listed a few programs that the city has to make sure that city facilities are efficient as well. One is our utility water loss audit. So we annually test our distribution system for leaks, and all distribution systems have leaks, and the city is around 10% water loss, which, how many of you think that sounds like a lot? 10% water loss in the distribution system. Kind of sounds like a lot. Yeah, I don't disagree, but it's actually really low. A lot of utilities have a much higher number, and if you're at around 10% with best practice, you're doing pretty good. So we consistently monitor that. We also have a pipe renovation program that is ongoing every year. So we are replacing some of those leaky pipes and older pipes that need to be upgraded. We're also upgrading all residential and commercial water meters to AMI meters. So we are, I think, about 70% of the way through. And basically what that means is that we'll take out your old meter, put in a new one, and then, which is basically, it's read remotely, and it can send data, water use data, every 15 minutes. And so this would tie into that customer water use portal I mentioned. And so if you have an AMI meter, you can actually get those real-time leak alerts with that portal. So those things are tied together. And again, that portal will be out shortly. The City Parks Department recently, a couple years ago, installed a central irrigation control system, which basically means that our city parks are hooked up to weather-based irrigation control as well. So that's something that's been going on for a couple of years. Some of our infrastructure at some parks is too old to tie into that, so we're still chipping away at it. We did swap out all of the plumbing fixtures in the senior center, which is a city facility, and are seeing about 40% reduction in water use since we did that. And we've installed high efficiency aerators in all the city facilities. And the new sports park that's coming online by the new high school is going to be served with non-potable water. So basically surface water, untreated water. And there'll be a lot of turf grass there, so that's a good thing. Okay, and I want to touch on some of the water supply planning projects. This is not comprehensive, but I just wanted to make sure I addressed a few things. And most of, actually all of these things come out of recommendations in that integrated water resources plan. So first, the city is currently doing a groundwater investigation to see what the opportunity is for us to have a groundwater supply. That would be really useful in times of drought. It's typically more resilient than a surface water supply. And those groundwater rights are not closed, as I mentioned earlier, whereas surface water rights are. We're also, we have something in our capital budget for the future to do an investigation on storage for our sourdough water rights. For any of you that have been here for a number of years, you'll remember there was a dam up in Sourdough, Mystic Lake. And if you have been paying attention the last couple of years, you might have known that a beaver recreated that dam. I don't know if anyone heard about that, but that's been resolved as well. So anyway, we don't have that dam, not the beaver dam. The other dam was breached intentionally back in the late 80s, I believe. And we haven't had any storage for our water rights since then. And so building a dam is not going to happen. We're not going to recreate Mystic, but there might be opportunities to have some natural storage. Beaver mimicry is actually a really good example of that. And so we do have a project kind of on the books to look at opportunities for some sort of natural storage in sourdough. We recently completed optimizing our Lyman Spring infrastructure so that that's a little more efficient. We've installed a lot of stream gauges and are actually working on getting a snow tall site installed up in sourdough as well. So that's in our capital improvement plan for this year. And it looks like that's moving ahead. And that may actually even get installed this year. And then I just put up there, up on the slide, highlight reservoir shares. That's just, I wanted to include that because the Integrated Water Resources Plan makes a really clear recommendation that to the extent that those shares become available for purchase, that the city strongly consider purchasing those. I think to date that it's only been a handful of those, but that is something that we look at as well. And last but not least, the city adopted its first drought management plan in 2017, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Does anyone have any questions before I switch gears?
I guess what
Yeah.
Are those gauges installed now on Bozeman and Sourdough Creek?
Yes. Let me get back to you on if the data is accessible. The Bozeman Creek gauge just went in like last summer, so I'm not sure where we're at on that data, but I can definitely follow up with you on that. Let you know. Yeah.
So I live in a neighborhood just outside city limits, southeast, and all of the properties there have well water, groundwater.
Okay.
So if the city were to annex my neighborhood, they presumably, the city would acquire those well rights?
Ooh, I think that depends. You know, water rights are, they are not necessarily tied to the land. So whoever would be the decision maker, not on the city side, but on the annexation side, the landowner could choose to keep the water rights. It also depends on, that would require a change application process through the Department of Natural Resources. And so they would have to approve that change as well. But the way I understand it is that really any annexation that happens in this, with the city, we would require that new number of homes or whatever it is be tied to our existing distribution system, if that makes sense. So you, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's usually a big piece of that. So you would end up using our surface water supplies, and what they would do with the groundwater rights associated with, it would just depend on how they approached it, I think. Yeah.
So as far as the groundwater investigation goes, how are they making sure that the groundwater isn't feeding into the surface water? And then
really good question. I think that's probably the biggest. This isn't my project. I don't have a lot of detail on it, I should say up front. But so I will say that the groundwater, being able to develop some sort of a groundwater supply, whatever that looks like and wherever that may be, does require mitigation. And so they do look really closely and require that if the city were to do this, they would require the city to make sure that we're mitigating our impacts at the same time, at the same place, and in the same amount. So if we're seeing, let's hypothetically say that we want to drill a well right next to Bozeman Creek or something. So that would mean we would have to probably hire an engineer to look at what those impacts would be for those three things at any given time, place, and for whatever volume that impact is. And then we would have to come to the table with a mitigation plan to basically make sure that we're addressing that. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but all to say that that's a really, really big piece of that project. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Kind of a related question.
Sure.
As you fix leaky pipes that could be supplying groundwater, is there some monitoring that would go on of groundwater at the same time to determine what impacts that might?
Not to my knowledge. That's a really good question. You know, I think generally groundwater is fairly high. It depends where you're at in the city. I know like out west, some of the west part of town is floating most of the time. But I'm not sure if anyone's looked at that. I know we're not required to look at that. But yeah.
I know some Colorado municipalities have taken to like buying up ranches and farms to acquire those water rights. Is that something that you're considering?
So it would, again, that would be something if that ranch or farm owner, that landowner had water rights, if they wanted to sell the water rights. So they could choose to sell that land if there's a developer interested in developing there, but keep the water rights. Or they could choose to do the opposite. And so, yeah, I think that to the extent that that's brought to the table to the city, if there is a farmer, let's say, with that, I think that the city looks at that on a case-by-case basis. Often, depending on where that water is, and a lot of agricultural water rights, for example, are only available for use in July and August. So, you know, how much is that really going to help the city, you know, serve everyone year round? There are a lot of different factors that go into that, and I believe the city just looks at it case by case. Sure. All right, let's dive into drought. So like I mentioned, the city adopted its first drought management plan in 2017. And I should define drought, and I never like doing that because there's so many definitions, but in general, especially for the city, who, as I mentioned, is really reliant on surface water and snowpack, that's what we are really concerned about. And so for the purposes of this, our drought definition is basically below normal water supplies like stream flow, groundwater, snowpack, and reservoir levels that result from a prolonged reduction in precipitation. So as I talk through this, that's kind of the definition that you could keep in mind. The drought plan, I highlighted a few of the main components of the drought plan on this slide. So it starts off with a vulnerability assessment, looking at how likely it is that the city will experience a drought. Talks about ways that the city should monitor our water supplies for that, and lays forth basically an outline for declaring a drought and the response measures that come along with that. So the response measures would be things that the city would ask community members to do to help mitigate or lessen the impacts from a drought event. So I will walk through some of these as we move forward. I did want to make a quick plug for the image on the slide here. This is our Bozeman drought meter, and it is published on the weather page in the Chronicle every Friday from June through September. And so this is one of the ways that we're trying to just make sure everyone's in tune with what's going on in terms of our water supply. So the drought management plan overarching objectives is really just to preserve essential public services if we're low on water, reduce negative impacts to health, safety, economy, and environment. And it also provides kind of a roadmap for implementation, talks about effective public communications, and coordination with other agencies as well. So I'm going to start with that vulnerability piece. I have a lot of slides on that because I think it's really important information, and then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of, you know, actions and things like that if we are in a drought. So to start off, Bozeman has experienced drought in the past, and so this image on the slide is the Palmer Drought Severity Index for from 1895 to 1995. And this is just one way of looking at drought. It really looks at precipitation and temperature, and basically using that data develops kind of a drought score. And what you can see here is that Bozeman is not the darkest color, but the second darkest. And so our region has actually experienced severe extreme drought about 15 to 20% of the time for that 100-year period, according to the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And there were actually only a couple other regions that had experienced drought more often than that. If you look even further back into history, this image is showing reconstructed annual average snow water equivalent using tree ring data. So if you're not familiar, you can actually look at tree rings to get a better idea of what the climate has been like for longer than we can do with the data that we have now. So this is looking at, again, reconstructed snow water equivalent, going all the way back to 1386 for our basin. And I have a little arrow pointing to when the Dust Bowl happened. And so you can see that the Dust Bowl was actually only the 5th driest 5-year period from basically here on. So if you look at just the second half of this image, that was the 5th driest period. So the take-home message here is that prolonged and severe drought has been a chronic issue in our region. And if you look at the last 20 years, so fast forward a little bit, this is also data from the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And you can see that Bozeman's experienced moderate to extreme drought a number of months between 2000 and 2006. So anything red or orange is bad. So we've experienced a lot of drought, and we expect to experience more due to climate change. So in general, we can expect more climate variability. But as I had mentioned earlier, the biggest impacts of that to our water supply are likely to be overall warming, reduced snowfall, and more rain precipitation, and earlier melting of snowpack. Ultimately, our reliance on our snowpack, our limited storage, the only water storage we have is in Highlight Reservoir. Both of those things really put us in a vulnerable place to any drought or climate change impacts. Just to build on that a little more, this image here is showing our April snowpack for, again, our basin. And you can see it goes from 1950 to the future, 2100. And so the black line is looking at our snowpack depth in history. So I think that goes up until about 2008. And then the two lines, the blue and the red line, are both projected impacts, or I shouldn't say impacts, excuse me, projected snow depths, depending on how severe climate change is and what the CO2 concentrations are. And basically, regardless of whether or not we see more or less impacts from climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, we expect our snowpack to decline either way. Someone mentioned wildfire earlier. That's definitely something that the city thinks about. I know it kind of keeps me up at night. Our watersheds, Highlight and Sourdough, haven't burned in a long time. And so, there's a pretty good chance that that's going to happen sometime in the future. And this graph, or this image here, is just showing that we expect to see increased wildfire frequency, duration, longer fire seasons, which I think the West has already been seeing for a number of years. And again, given our forested watershed, we're very susceptible to impacts from that. That could definitely impact our water quality. My understanding of it is that we would likely see the biggest impacts after the burn, not right when it's going on. I will mention our water treatment plant was built. It was built pretty recently. I can't recall the year offhand, but it was built with safeguards against exactly that. So there is some capacity in our infrastructure to handle that, but it would just depend on how severe the fire was. And last but certainly not least, the city wants to be a good neighbor. We have a lot of downstream water users that rely on the same water supplies that we do. And so to that end, we're a little more vulnerable from drought impacts as well. When you take the human element into that drought definition, it complicates it. And we just want to keep in mind that there are a lot of other people relying on that same resource. So moving into drought monitoring, I just wanted to touch on how we do this. So we monitor for drought regularly throughout the year. And if our water supplies are looking like they're in rough shape, we increase how often we monitor. But we're looking at a few different things. So we look at local indicators, specifically reservoir levels and highlight, area stream flow, and then snowpack. We look at the snow water equivalent data in the snowpack. And then we look at a few regional and national indices as well, including the Palmer Drought Index, which I mentioned earlier, the US Drought Monitor, and the Standard Precipitation Index. And I could talk for a half hour about how all this works and how we weight everything differently, but I won't do that. So anyway, there is a lot of methodology that goes into how we look at this data. And ultimately, when we enter all of this data in this drought tool that we have, it spits out a drought score, 1 through 4. And then we use that data as city staff to potentially, if it looks like, you know, our water supplies aren't in good shape, we may make a recommendation for a drought declaration. This image up here is from the US Drought Monitor in 2017. If you'll recall, we in Bozeman and in Gallatin County were not as affected, but a lot of the state experienced really severe drought conditions that year. So I touched on this, but basically if we're monitoring for drought and we see that, oh, it doesn't look good, I think we need to, you know, try to do what we can to minimize the impacts of this water shortage or, you know, dry spell, whatever you'd like to call it. Basically, the Director of Public Works would make a recommendation to the City Commission. There are 5 members on the City Commission, and they vote on a lot of different things every Monday night. And this would be one of those things. So it would be at a public meeting, and we would recommend a drought stage declaration, as well as the response measures to implement along with that. So for example, if it was a stage 1, we would likely just try to increase our messaging about water conservation. If it was a stage 4 drought, we would likely have a lawn watering ban. So just kind of depending on the drought stage, those response measures or actions would just be pursuant to that. But ultimately, the City Commission decides if and when to declare a drought. We do communicate about drought regularly with the community. If we were to be in a severe drought situation, we would do a little bit more targeted messaging, but messaging is ongoing even when we're not in a drought. And again, it would just increase if drought conditions were looking pretty bad, especially in a stage 3 or 4 drought. So I do want to talk a little bit about the response measures or those actions that we would ask residents to take if we're in a drought stage. So the guiding principles for that is really to overall minimize adverse financial effects, avoid permanent loss of natural resources, restrict less essential use before essential use. That's lawn watering ban is a great example of that. And then affect individuals or smaller groups before larger groups. So again, as I mentioned, the response measures would actually be declared on a case-by-case basis by the commission, the City Commission. But in general, we would expect that in a stage 1, there would be no mandatory water restrictions. We would just increase our messaging. If we had a stage 2 drought, we might set some temporary rules for time of day watering and maybe day of week watering to try to just reduce it across the board on all residents, but without letting your landscapes go altogether. If we were to experience a stage 3 or 4 drought, we would definitely be in a serious water supply issue. So at that point, we would likely have a requirement that nobody can water their lawns. We would have some provisions likely to keep trees alive and things like that. We don't want to lose that permanent resource, but lawns are pretty resilient and will likely come back the next year. So, and if you see at the top of the screen there, the goal behind each of these the response measures is to achieve an overall water use reduction across all customer classes. And so the goal would be to decrease water use by 10% in a stage 1 drought, 20% in stage 2, and so on. And so we do have the response measures are created and targeted to try to achieve an overall reduction. And I will just mention, the goal of our communication plan would to not be to have to do any enforcement, but should we have to, if we're in a drought and someone is a big offender and just watering their lawn and not in tune with what's going on, we would do targeted outreach. But if we couldn't reach that person through warning letters and things like that, we could fine and ultimately shut off the water to that house or whatever it may be. And that's all I have. I was hoping that we could have Q&A if anyone has questions. Yeah.
So which smaller groups of people would you increase the water use first?
For the drought response
Yeah,
measures?
You said that there's like some groups who try to affect smaller groups of people before larger groups of people.
Yeah.
Which ones are on that line?
Great question. I guess maybe the intent with that comment was, you know, we would probably require that single family homes reduce lawn watering before we would say that all parks or public spaces would be required, because that could be an opportunity for anyone to go enjoy a lawn, for example, rather than each person having their own kind of lush green lawn. So I think that was kind of the intent behind that. Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear. Sure.
I have two questions. One is how does the university look in terms of water use efficiency and conservation? How does campus fit into that? And then the other is I'm curious about what other communities around the country you look to for guidance and inspiration and how you structured this plan. What other places to do it?
Absolutely, great questions. So MSU is awesome in terms of water efficiency. About 10 years ago or so, the campus went to an entirely a surface water system for irrigation. So when you see those sprinklers running during the day or whatever it may be, that's surface water. It's not treated drinking water. And as I understand it, the campus does need to run irrigation systems all day because there are so many. They do a great job with efficiency in terms of outdoor water use and indoor water use as well. There have been a lot of projects to replace old plumbing fixtures in dorms and in some of the buildings. Duke Elliott, he's I'm not sure his title, but he works, he's an engineer, I think, for the university who takes a lot of that on. And I know that there have been, I believe there were like some 7 gallon per flush urinals. There were anyway. I think that most of those are gone, but MSU has taken big steps in that and reduced water use substantially. And in all of the new buildings are basically doing everything they can to make sure all of the water using fixtures are efficient. Recently, the city actually kind of rebated. I don't know if anyone saw this in the paper, but the city issued a rebate to the university because of all of their efforts on water conservation over the years. And it's basically in the form of reduced fees for future buildings. But anyway, MSU has done a great job in terms of water efficiency. And in terms of what cities and other towns, the city, or I can only speak for myself, but I look to for inspiration and ideas. Certainly Western cities. I try to look at cities that are similar in size to Bozeman, but given our unique issues with population growth and things, I try to look at bigger cities as well. Tucson Water is a great example. They've had water issues for a long time. Bend, Oregon, Fort Collins, Colorado, and things like that. So those are some of the kind of the go-to cities I look to for that. Yeah.
How many other cities in Montana have a person like you?
Great question. None. Yeah, so I used to always mention that, and I guess I haven't done that lately, but yeah, Bozeman's the only city with an actual dedicated conservation staff person. And if you can see over here, Nicole joined us in June, and so there are 2 of us now. Yeah, so Bozeman's it. Yeah.
What is the water market like in the Gallatin Valley? Is there much buying and selling of water in Bozeman?
You know, I'm admittedly not the best person to answer that question. It doesn't I don't think it's a big water market, especially if you compare it to other Western cities that have really big water issues, you know, like California and things like that. But yeah, I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that.
So what do we do with our excess capacity or whatever? We just let it go, or is there any attempt to sell that?
No, well, no, we definitely don't want to sell any of it, especially given our growth rate and things like that. So, you know, I'm not sure this is answering your question, but in terms of how that, like using water and making sure we have the right amount every day works is basically the water treatment plant is in communication with the dam tender up in Highlight. And so we look at our existing and past water demands, and it's very different from winter to summer, of course. And so we look at that information to determine how much water to basically ask for out of the dam. That might be the best answer I have. Yeah.
So there must be a relationship between population growth and the transformation of land from agriculture to developed small development or large development. Is it part of your projection or part of your thinking, I guess, in the city, thinking about given 30,000 more people, where are people going to go? And if it moves towards residential, that's a huge water savings probably, right? Or are there discussions about that? Or
Yeah, you're actually right. That came up actually at a presentation last week as well. Yeah, so, and I think what you're saying is that agricultural land uses a lot of water. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, if you took an acre of agricultural land and an acre of single family or multifamily homes, yeah, certainly those homes would use less water than was being used earlier. The city is currently working on a new growth plan. And so that'll be an update to the last one, which I believe was in 2009, if I remember correctly. So that'll be a better projection of where we're going to grow and how. So that'll look at the direction we're growing and what that zoning looks like, whether it be single family or multifamily and things like that. So we're working on that right now.
the only other thing I wanted to mention is the efficiency measures in the city. This is a big discussion in the agricultural community in terms of becoming more efficient is actually paradoxically like leading to less water downstream because more of it's being consumed by crops or whatever. I don't know if in the city there's extra flow that then feeds groundwater, and so becoming more efficient in our lawns actually reduces groundwater recharge in this weird way. I just wondered if that was also part of the discussion.
Not specifically with residential watering. I think like the greater picture of kind of how much supply the city has and, you know, how much of that is recharging, since it's all surface water right now, how much of that is recharging groundwater. But no, I don't think we've looked at it on like that granular of a scale before. Yeah.
Do you have, kind of along those lines, do you have a rough estimate of how much water goes into the system? You said 10% leaked.
Oh, mm-hmm.
But compared to how much goes through the water reclamation facility at the other end?
I don't know the difference between, well, I guess it'd be about half of the water used.
So the irrigation of lawns pretty much doesn't end up getting treated. It becomes groundwater.
Yeah, and that 50% number is just looking at summer use. So if you look at total annual use across all customer classes, 30% across the whole year is used on lawns. So essentially, I guess 30%, likely 30% less would end up going to the wastewater facility.
We do have a question from an online.
Oh, sure.
This is from Tony Hartshorn, and so he has two questions. The first is, he says, I heard a hint about a new Snowtel site. That's awesome. Is there anything you can figure out how to prototype a Snowtel like version 2 that might cost 1% of the Snowtel version 1 price tag? The first question. And the second question is, what highlight watershed forest management practices are being considered to reduce the risk of high post-fire sediment delivery?
Okay, Tony, great questions. First question, if I understand it correctly, is he just asking for what opportunity is there for like better?
I think in developing a cheaper type of Snowtel technology that is a reduction in the price tag of what the original Snowtel technology develop and install.
Right. If I understand the question correctly, I mean, at least from the city's perspective, you know, we try to take a data-driven approach to everything that we do. And so to that end, if there were an alternative to a snowtell site that would achieve the same goal of being able to measure our snowpack, we would absolutely love to discuss that. I know that there were a couple gentlemen that we met with about a year ago that were at least affiliated with MSU that were working on exactly that. They were working on a new small prototype to achieve basically the same kind of data tracking that a snowtell does, but I can't recall offhand who their names were, but Tony, I could get back to you on that. And the second question, I'm sorry. Could you remind me?
So what highlight watershed forest management practices are being considered to reduce the risk of high post-fire sediment delivery?
Okay, so in terms of best management practices, we do have funding in one of our capital improvement projects to do some thinning of, the city owns land up in Sourdough. And so I didn't mention that earlier, but the city does own land. And so we do have some funding to thin that forest to reduce the likelihood of a really long, intense fire and what the impacts would be. In terms of specifically in highlight, we do not, partly because we don't own any land up there, and so we're a little bit limited in kind of our freedom in terms of doing different land management on It's All Forest Service. So hopefully that answers your question, Tony. I'm the only one? Okay, great.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.